We live in a world full of bad news. We're bombarded with it each and every day. You turn on the television, there's some bad news. You get some emails, you get some texts, you have conversations. We're always hearing bad news. Isn't it about time that we get some good news? Well, I am so glad to tell you that's exactly why Jesus came. He came to give us good news. In fact, there's a word that summarizes the message of Christ, and it's called the gospel. I want to read to you what Apostle Paul wrote. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote about 2/3 of the letters that we read inside of the New Testament, and he said this in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes." The gospel causes us to not be ashamed. Now, what's interesting is that word gospel actually literally means good news. And we're going to unpack that in just a moment. But let's go back to I'm not ashamed because of the gospel. You know, when I look at my life and I look at all the things I'm ashamed of, and all of us probably have quite a few of those things that we look back in our past and we're not too proud of some of those moments, some of those decisions. For me, when I look back at those, every single one of those is because I operated and made choices outside of the gospel. Anytime I choose to disobey God's word and the gospel, I find that really ultimately it just leads to shame inside of my life. Now, why is the gospel called good news? Now, in the New Testament, it was written in the language of Greek, and there's a lot of rich meanings when we unpack some of those Greek definitions. So the word gospel comes from the Greek word evangelon, which means evangelism. It actually is really the first term for evangelist. In the old times, people didn't take baths like every day like we take because they didn't have access to running water. So people might go a few days, weeks. They're also in a hot climate, so just imagine it's hot. People didn't bathe. They're out working. They're sweating. People weren't have access to cologne and perfumes. So to summarize it, pretty much everything stank. People stank. And so the evangelist would come into the town, and what they would be yelling, "Good news." That's actually what they said. Good news. Why did they bring good news? Because they were selling soap. And to a society that was very stinky, soap was very good news. There's a lot of rich meaning for us. You know, when we look at our life, it stinks. Why? Because sin stinks. Sin always causes things to stink. If there is stink inside of marriage, you can usually trace it back to sin. If things are stinking inside of your relationship with your kids, there's things called sin. And I'm not pointing to the kids per se, but yes, they probably got a lot too. Sin just stinks. And so the good news of the gospel is Jesus came to deal with the sin that causes our life to stink. That's the good news of the gospel. Now, that word power, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God. In the Greek, it means dunamis. That's literally where we get the word dynamite from. God's word doesn't lack power. It's not just empty. It's not just a story. It is an explosive force to bring about life change, to set us free from habits, to set us free from addictions. It's the power of God to literally transform our life. Now, I want to talk about that word salvation. Paul wasn't ashamed of the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God for what? Salvation. That word in the Greek means sozo, and that means to save entirely, to save completely. It's the complete package. Why? Because Jesus cares about every single part of your life. Jesus didn't just come so you could be saved from hell and go to heaven. Yes, that's part of the good news, but he cares about saving every part of your life, spirit, soul, and body. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further inside of this course. So the good news is this: Jesus cares about every part of your life. The gospel is the power of God to touch and to change and to remove what stinks from every single part of your life. I love the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10. You're probably going to hear that verse many times throughout this course, and it is, The thief comes not but to kill, steal, and destroy, but I have come that you might have life and that you might have it abundantly. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, came that we might have abundant life. Jesus didn't just come to give you a little bit of life, a little bit of joy. Jesus came to touch and bring life to every single part of your world. Now, I do want to give a little footnote, a little bit of a disclaimer here, and I want to read to you something else Jesus said, the Gospel of John chapter 16, verse 33. These things I've spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. Jesus did come to give you a complete salvation experience, but he also said, look, this side of heaven, there's going to be problems, there's going to be storms, there's going to be tribulations, but in the midst of that, you can still have peace. In the midst of that, we can still have joy. Why? Because he overcame the world. A little bit later in this course, we're going to talk about why do we still have problems and how does Jesus help us through those. So you want to get to that part of the course for sure. But this side of heaven, we're going to have some challenges, but Jesus is with us through every one of them, and the salvation power of God will touch every single part of our life if we allow it and invite Jesus to do just that. We're going to look a little bit further at this word salvation, because what we're going to find is we're going to see what Jesus saved us from, and we're going to see what Jesus saved us for.